I may remark that the curious transformations many formulae can undergo, the unsuspected and to a beginner apparently impossible identity of forms exceedingly dissimilar at first sight, is I think one of the chief difficulties in the early part of mathematical studies. I am often reminded of certain sprites and fairies one reads of, who are at one's elbows in one shape now, and the next minute in a form most dissimilar.
When he was about to embark upon what would prove to be his last adventure, Byron made his feelings in terms of a taste for poetry in me clear in a letter addressed to my mother. Is the girl imaginative? Is she social or solitary, taciturn or talkative, fond of reading or otherwise? And what is her tic? I mean her foible, is she passionate? I hope that the gods have made her anything save poetical. It is enough to have one such fool in a family. It goes without saying that my mom, who was convinced it was my father's romanticism and passionate nature, which was the root of all evil in their marriage, was more than eager to discourage any poetical endeavors in me. However, blood is thicker than water. Everyone wanted to know what kind of creature would emerge from the union of poetry and geometry, liberty and license, imagination and calculation. I inherited my father's romantic spirit, a trait that my mother tried to temper by having me tutored in mathematics. Not only did I write my own poetry pieces, the combination produced in me a love for what I was calling poetical science, which linked my rebellious imagination to my enchantment with numbers. My father accused my mother of trying to drain my blood from out thy being, an attainment that would be in vain. Still thou wouldst love me, still that more than life retain. He was right about the blood. My mom arranged a fearsome attack on me to eradicate any signs of Byronism from me. She made me lie still for prolonged periods of time, hoping it would help me to develop self-discipline. As a punishment for disobedience, she would lock me in a closet for hours. And she hired a team of furies, as I called them, to monitor my each and every step. They would often exaggerate and invent stories about me. Not surprisingly, my natural reaction was a rebellion, resulted in my turning any disagreement into a French Revolution, as my mother called it.
Despite my mother doing her best to eradicate any Byron's features in me, I, anyway, possessed some of his rebellious personality. When I was 17, I made an attempt to escape with one of my teachers. Unfortunately, I was caught by his relatives, who recognized me, and returned to my mother. My mom and her friends tried to cover up the incident, to avoid a public scandal.
After that unsuccessful attempt to elope with the teacher, I felt I was losing control, so I agreed to submit myself to a program of reform, devised by Dr. William King, one of my mother's Methodist friends. He was a physician, who would later run a lunatic asylum. According to him, there was only one thing that would quell the passions of a young girl like me: mathematics. So there I was, indulging myself into an intensive study of mathematics that would last over a decade. I was presented at court at the age of 17, and became a popular belle of the season. By 1834 I was a regular at court, and started attending different events. I danced often, and was able to charm many people with my cheerful nature and brilliant mind, as some called it, and was described as being dainty. In 1833, Mary Somerville, one of my tutors, who I loved and respect, introduced me to Charles Babbage, a mathematician, engineer and inventor. Babbage organized regular shows at his Marylebone home to show off his inventions, and these became the fashion in the London social events list of the 1830s. Everyone attended the show, from earls to engineers. Most people wanted to see Babbage's Silver Lady, a scantily clad mechanical doll which would dance impressively lifelike pirouettes and arabesques on demand. However, it was the difference engine Babbage wanted to impress his visitors with. A calculating machine that could automatically process complex calculations. He claimed that it could also perform miracles, not raising the dead or anything quite as spectacular as that. but running through a predictable sequence of numbers from which it would spontaneously depart and then return, as though by its own volition. I was absolutely fascinated by the machine. It was rigidly regulated by precise mathematical laws, but it seemed to have its own will. It was as though I had finally found a product of poetical science, a solution for reconciling the tension between the need for regulation and desire for liberation that had split my parents apart. Other visitors gazed at the working of this amazing mechanism with a puzzled expression. I, despite my young age, was able to understand its working, and saw the great beauty of the invention. I became obsessed with Babbage's work, and I made up my mind to convince Babbage to become my tutor. I wrote a letter to him. I have a peculiar way of learning, and I think it must be a peculiar man to teach me successfully. Do not reckon me conceited, but I believe I have the power of going just as far as I like in such pursuits, and where there is so decided a taste, I should almost say a passion, as I have for them, I question if there is not always some portion of natural genius even. It might have been some bragging on my part to describe myself as a genius, but, in the end I had won my mentor's recognition and admiration, as he later called me affectionately the Enchantress of Numbers. On the 8th of July 1835, I married William, 8th Baron King, who I had been introduced to through my beloved tutor Mary Somerville. Thus I became Lady King, and 3 years later, my husband and I were made Earl and Countess of Lovelace respectively. We had contacts with many influential people of the era, scientists such as Andrew Cross, Charles Babbage, Sir David Brewster, Charles Wheatstone, Michael Faraday, and the author Charles Dickens. We had 2 sons who I named after my father, Byron and Gordon, and a daughter, called Annabella, after my mother. My husband and I shared love for horses, which must have been possessed by our daughter. She also had a lifelong love of horses, dating from childhood, and became an accomplished equestrienne. Her interest in the Arabian horse led to her interest in saving the Arabian breed and thus her and her husband's journeys. Annabella traveled extensively in the Middle East and is particularly noted as the first European woman to ride through the Arabian desert to reach the city of Har, Illinois. Together with her husband, Wilfrid Blunt, they founded the Crabbet Arabian Stud, also known as the Crabbet Park Stud, an English horse breeding farm, where they imported and breeded the best Arabian horses. My husband was supportive of my scientific pursuits. And, since we were well off, we could afford nannies and governesses to look after our kids. So, when I received an offer to translate an article by the military engineer Luigi Minabrea, later Prime Minister of Italy, about the analytical engine, a sophisticated version of Babbage's difference machine, I gladly agreed. Babbage was obsessed with an idea of designing a machine that would mark the transition from mechanized arithmetic to full-fledged general-purpose computation. The major innovation was that the analytical engine was to be programmed using punched cards. The engine was intended to use loops of Jackwood's punched cards to control a mechanical calculator, which could use as input the results of preceding computations. The machine was also intended to employ several features, including sequential control, branching and looping. Describing the engine's programming by punch cards, I wrote in my notes attached to the translation of the article. We may say most aptly that the analytical engine weaves algebraical patterns just as the Jackwood loom weaves flowers and leaves. I engaged myself in this work like devil-possessed, supplementing the translation of the article with a set of 7 notes, which I simply called notes. The 7th one contained what many consider to be the first computer program, that is, an algorithm for Bernoulli numbers, designed to be carried out by a machine.
Circumstances have been such that I have lived almost entirely secluded for some time. Those who are much in earnest and with single minds devoted to any great object in life must find this occasionally inevitable.
My mentally and time-consuming hard work seemed to have been paid off. The notes I added to the translation of the article explaining how the analytical engine works were 3 times longer than the article itself. While working on the project, I was able to see the machine's potential to go beyond mere calculating or number crunching. I had a vision of this computer to produce some artworks, even creating music.
The analytical engine might act upon other things besides number, were objects found whose mutual fundamental relations could be expressed by those of the abstract science of operations, and which should be also susceptible of adaptations to the action of the operating notation and mechanism of the engine. Supposing, for instance, that the fundamental relations of pitched sounds in the science of harmony and of musical composition were susceptible of such expression and adaptations, the engine might compose elaborate and scientific pieces of music of any degree of complexity or extent.
I fully appreciated the concept of a general-purpose machine. And it seemed to me truly amazing that it could potentially process any symbolic notations, including artistic and musical ones. So I set out to share the vision of it, which I considered to be poetical, in my notes. Yet, despite being able to foresee the wonderful potential of the analytical engine in the future, in my opinion, it didn't seem to be possible for the machine to think independently.
The analytical engine has no pretensions to originate anything. It can do whatever we know how to order it to perform.
Despite my mother's efforts, I remained my father's daughter, with a poetic sensibility that allowed me to view an equation as a brushstroke that painted an aspect of nature's physical splendor. But math's appeal goes even deeper, it is spiritual. Math constitutes the language through which alone we can adequately express the great facts of the natural world, and it allows us to portray the changes of mutual relationship that unfold in creation. It is the instrument through which the weak mind of man can most effectually read his Creator's works.
I am more than ever now the bride of science. Religion to me is science, and science is religion. In that deeper felt truth lies the secret of my intense devotion to the reading of God's natural works. It is reading Him, His will, His intelligence, and this again is learning to obey and to follow, to the best of our power, that will. The intellectual, the moral, the religious seem to me all naturally bound up and interlinked together in one great and harmonious whole. That God is one, and that all the works and the feelings He has called into existence are one.
I was able to understand the connection between poetry and analysis in ways that transcended my father's talents. I wrote in my letter to Babbage, I do not believe that my father was, or ever could have been, such a poet as I shall be an analyst, for with me the two go together indissolubly. My life now became an experiment in the poetical science. I became engaged in exotic new ideas, such as mesmerism, phrenology, and materialism. Mesmerism was a particular field of interest for me. John Eliot's son, a professor of medicine at London University College, had started to experiment with his patients, using magnetic sleep, or hypnosis, as an anesthetic. His work had produced some remarkable results, and became the subject of several scientific articles. Eliotson's work seemed to be fascinating to me, perhaps, because it suggested a way of linking the power of emotions with the flux of electromagnetic forces, or animal magnetism, in mesmerical language, in the body. This produced inspiration for my next project, following my work on the analytical engine. I was planning to develop a calculus of the nervous system, a theoretical model that would link mathematics with feelings. I sought out a few of the British leading experimental scientists as potential collaborators for this project, including the great pioneer of electromagnetism, Michael Faraday. Unfortunately, Faraday declined my offer, as he was ill. So I turned to a friend of his, the reclusive electrician Andrew Cross, who worked in his laboratory in Somerset. Local farmers called him the Thunder and Lightning Man, because of explosions and flashes produced by his experiments, reinforcing the legend that he had been a model for Dr. Frankenstein. Mary Shelley had attended a lecture Andrew Cross gave in London on electricity, the gases, and the phantasmagoria. In 1841, Medora Lee, the daughter of Lord Byron's half-sister Augusta Lee, and I were told by my mother that Byron was also Medora's father. In response, I wrote to my mother, I am not in the least astonished. In fact, you merely confirm what I have for years and years felt scarcely a doubt about, but should have considered it most improper in me to hint to you that I in any way suspected. I did not blame the incestuous relationship on Byron, but instead blamed Augusta Lee. I fear she is more inherently wicked than he ever was. I felt that, to some extent, I could sympathize with him, since I knew the power of latent, but sometimes overwhelming sexual feelings myself. I did not confine my researches to purely scientific subjects. I wanted to experiment with social conventions as well. I was outspoken and often shocking, much to the alarm of my straight-laced husband, Lord Lovelace, who had political ambitions that were threatened by my behavior. I was not meant to finish my project with Cross, but I did develop some affection to his son, who I had taken as an assistant in my scientific work. In the 1840s, I became a subject of rumors of affairs with men, which might have reached my mother, Annabella, since she assigned William Benjamin Carpenter to teach my children, and to act as a moral instructor for me. However, he quickly fell for me, and encouraged me to express any frustrated affections, claiming that his marriage meant he would never act in an unbecoming manner. When it became clear that Carpenter was trying to start an affair, I cut it off. I had another weakness, which put me in a lot of financial and emotional troubles. During the later 1840s, I lost more than £3,000 on the horses. At the same time, suffering from constant health issues with digestive system and migraines, I tried out drugs, notably laudanum and opium, prescribed by doctors, but also newer narcotics like cannabis, using a sample given to me by an explorer, to see how they could control my fluctuating moods. The gambling led to my forming a syndicate with male friends, and an ambitious attempt in 1851 to create a mathematical model for successful large bets, not surprisingly, under the influence of opiates. This went disastrously wrong, leaving me thousands of pounds in debt to the syndicate, and forcing me to admit it all to my husband. In the summer of 1851, I discovered I had terminal cancer. I lost contact with my husband after confessing something to him on the 30th of August, which caused him to abandon my bedside. The illness lasted several months. As I lay on my deathbed, drifting in and out of consciousness, my mother appeared at my side. She took command over whom I saw, and excluded all of my friends and confidants. I has had a shadowy relationship with Andrew Cross's son John from 1844 onwards. I had bequeathed him the only heirlooms my father had personally left to me. During my final illness, I would panic at the idea of the younger Cross being kept from visiting me. My mom did her best in my last days to extract a confession of my previous conduct. Eventually, after one final battle of wills with my mother, I gave in. Have I lived to hear it? She triumphantly wrote in her diary. She has just said there is but one reason why I could wish for life, to live with you entirely. She believes that with my protection, she might have gone through life happily for herself and others. What a change. I keep saying to myself, wonderful God. But I had a few acts of defiance left in me, the final being an instruction that I was to be buried in my father's grave, to lie with the man who in life I had been forced to reject, but in death could at last embrace.